through. He's going to Rosh Hashanah with a green ticket.
All good, yeah.
Let me do a few more Gemaras.
True what?
Ran out of shirt.
No Mountain Dew today.
I did. I had it on. I drank it.
I didn't want you to touch the wrong.
I just think I was taking one shot. No, way good. There's something wrong with it.
Between you and me. What I mentioned.
Yeah, for sure.
Side.
All right, so we are continuing in the Gemara on Tractate Sanhedrin, page Kuf Zayin 107a. Happens to be a very long daf. Tractate Sanhedrin has a lot of those. It's a very long page, and we are about 2/3 of the way down.
Let's see what's the page.
If you are following in the art scroll, we are on 107A3. Very top of 107A3.
Okay, there.
Right in the middle of 107A.
Okay.
How does it start?
So the portion we're up to is Darash Rava. Rava expounded. My dechsiv ki ani litzela nachon machovi negdi tani. Get it for you.
Oh, here we go.
Got it?
That's it.
Oh, sorry. One my help.
Thanks.
Yeah, there's several Darash Rava.
Yeah, I know now.
Okay, so quick review. We're not gonna go through last week's Gemara in detail, but basically last week we spoke about the sin of David HaMelech, although I say that with a caveat because the Talmud says that very literally, whoever says David sinned is making a mistake. So what that means is that the story of David and Batsheva, which by externally it looks like David sinned with a married woman, but as we explained, the Talmud tells us that at that point, due to a unique law, she was not actually married. And let's take a step back. David, as we spoke about last week, challenges God, so to say. And he says, why am I not mentioned in the beginning of the Amidah prayer? Only Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov are mentioned. And God responds, you're not mentioned because they passed tests, which you haven't faced the tests that they faced. So David said, test me. So God says, not only am I going to test you, basically Gemara says a person shouldn't do that. You shouldn't look for situations to be tested by, even though you may think it's a good idea. That's we challenge ourselves, so perhaps look for tests. It's important to know the difference between challenging yourself and looking for tests. Okay, challenging yourself is okay. Yesterday I studied this amount, today I'll study a little more. That's challenging yourself. But to walk into a situation which will tempt you, especially if it's a situation which will tempt you in a very strong way, to sin, that a person shouldn't do. And this is the source of that. So God says to David HaMelech, not only will I test you, I'll tell you what the test will be about. It'll be about area of morality. I'm going to test your moral strength. And it says David HaMelech then, we got into a situation of how he prepared himself. He made a mistake in even preparing himself and how he would overcome that test. But then he was tested because he went out to the rooftop. And it says that's where he saw Batsheva, who was bathing. And as the Gemara fills in, how that seems to be immodest. Why would a woman be bathing publicly? But it says no, she was under some sort. There was an awning, and a bird flew, which was really the Satan trying to distract David. And David HaMelech shot an arrow at the bird, and the arrow instead, or maybe in addition to the bird, was able to tear off the cover. And that's when he saw Batsheva, and he was immediately smitten or drawn to her, and he had her brought to him, and that's when they had relations together. So that was the sin of David HaMelech. We did explain an interesting explanation, a deeper understanding of this idea of the awning and the bird. We gave another deeper understanding of it, is that the awning was actually, the awning which protected him from seeing her is a metaphor for his Torah study. That as long as he was involved in Torah study, then he was shielded from that which he would be tempted by. As soon as he left Torah study and he removed that protective shield, immediately he was drawn to her. And that's pretty much the story as we spoke about it last week. And we explained the many messages in the story of this mistake that David HaMelech did. Again, even though, again, we explained that according to the Talmud, it wasn't a sin. Why not? Because her husband went off to war. And before he went off to war, he gave her a conditional divorce, which basically said that if I don't return from war, you are divorced as of now. And Uriah eventually did not come back from war. And so therefore, at that point, she was, retroactively, she was a single woman or a divorced woman by the time they were together. Yes?
I heard something that David HaMelech actually had the husband killed or something.
Yeah, I was just
So
asking.
what do you mean by had him killed? He had him sent
Put to the front line.
to the front lines of war. True. The Gemara doesn't get into that over here.
No.
But nevertheless, the result remains that once he doesn't return from war, she is now retroactively a divorced woman. Yes, that is part of the story. It's an important part of the story. But nevertheless,
He sent Uriah.
he finds out who her husband is and where he is stationed in war, and he has him sent to the front.
So
line.
at the time of being with Batsheva, it was a problem. At that moment, until he was killed.
No,
No,
because
The moment he decided
I
he's going
think
to
it is that
war,
rule.
he gave her a conditional get.
The
But
get
she's
is
not divorced.
called retroactive. Yes.
But
It's
it's
interesting.
Until he dies.
No, that doesn't matter. But once he does die, so now she was a divorced woman who decided to go
I'm
on
saying
war.
until Uriah dies, 1 week later. That period of 1 week, David HaMelech didn't do a sin.
It's a potential sin.
We wait to
No,
see.
wait to
Is that
see.
true? That's
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, we'd have to look into the details of that halacha, of how it works, of this conditional get. But yes, when you do that, and the Gemara talks about this, like, what if someone gives, okay, I mean, just because this question was raised, because it is a fascinating topic, we said you could do conditional marriage too. You could say, you are betrothed to me, you are married, betrothal, which is really marriage, it causes kiddushin, on condition that I will, again, buy this house. And then the Gemara says, what about before I buy the house, someone else says, you're betrothed to me. And she accepts. Now what? She accepted the first one. She accepted the first one on condition. Now the second one comes in. So I believe it. Again, we have to go back. Maybe this will be a good topic to explore in a future Gemara class. But I believe the answer is, well, we wait and see. If he fulfills the condition, the second condition, the second betrothal is nothing. But if he doesn't fulfill the condition, then now she's betrothed to that second. So it's a period of time in which you are stuck in limbo of we are not sure what this day will be. Yes,
But
so it's
she's
very
not
interesting.
engaged.
What's that?
The moment the first one conditionally said that he's going to marry her,
Yeah.
she's not at this time engaged.
There's no such thing as engaged in halakha. Engaged has no halakhic significance. You're either betrothed or not betrothed.
No.
What we call engaged.
Me'oreset.
No, he says hareat mekudesh. Mekudesh is meureset. Kiddushin and erusin is the same thing. Nisuin is something else. But we don't say hareat musua. You say hareat mekudeshet. You say you are betrothed. What's that?
You don't get engaged?
The people get engaged. But I'm saying halachically, when a couple says, when let's say today, when a Jewish man proposes to a woman and says they agree and they are now engaged, halachically there's no significance to that. There's no there doesn't mean
So
anything.
he's admitted at that point?
No, they're not. There's no halachic connection between them.
What's the halachic?
Halachic means there's no Jewish legal connection between them. When they say that we're if a man and woman say we've agreed that we are engaged to be married, that is a secular term, and there's no halachic significance to that term. Now, we're going to a tangent to another tangent. In some circles, they do something during the engagement period called tanai, where they make some conditions with one another, so then they are bound by their conditions. But even that's not any sort of kiddushin. There's no link of marriage between them yet. Anyway, so all this is, let's take a few steps back to where we were talking about. The bottom line is that David HaMelech, is not considered to be having sinned a shasish of adultery. However, as we're going to see in today's Talmud, the public wasn't necessarily aware of it. This sin became known, and in the public's eye, it certainly looked like an act of adultery. And that in itself is significant. That the fact that the eye of the public, because again, even as we imagine the scenario as it happened, at the time that he was with Batsheva, Uriah was alive. So it is certainly has a look of adultery to it. And as we're going to see, that's a prominent part of David HaMelech's tshuva process, which we're going to talk about more today. And that's where we continue. And here you'll see some very interesting things. So you see the person who's elaborating a lot on this story is Rava. And what he does is he points and he finds verses in Tehillim, which if you read through Tehillim, through Psalms, the verses on its own may be kind of confusing or shrouded in mystery. But when you link it to this story, suddenly those verses are very significant. So here's the next one. Rava said the following. Darash Rava. Rava said, what is the meaning of the verse? And again, if you have a Tehillim, you have some over there, but I forget. What is the meaning of the verse which states, and this is Tehillim, chapter 38, verse number 18. And it seems like a really strange verse. The verse is, Ki ani litzela nachom umachovi negdi samid. Ki ani litzela nachom umachovi negdi samid. What is the verse? What's the translation of that verse? Literally, for I was suited for the rib. Ki ani litzela nachom. Tzela is a rib or a side. In other words, I matched up with the side or with the rib. Machovi means my pain. Negdi tame is always opposite. What does that mean? And this is one verse. We're not bringing two different verses. Somehow this is all connected. I was suited for the rib, and my pain is always before me. What could that possibly mean?
Maybe Adam HaRishon.
So Adam HaRishon, we know that he had the tzela. It says that God took the tzela, the side of Adam, and turned it into Chava, the rib.
And also,
So what does that have to do with David HaMelech?
Adam HaRishon gave 70 years of his life to David
So Adam, we have a medrash says that Adam was destined really to live 1,000 years, but he saw in the future this powerful soul, which was not given any life really. He said, I'd like to donate 70 years of my life to them. Talk about a transplant, gift of life. Adam HaRishon gave literally 70 years of life to David HaMelech. Okay, but what does that have to do with here? So you say maybe well, how does Adam's tzela have to do with David? So here's how Rava explains it. Okay, so you're saying David is representing Adam HaRishon. Well, let's see what Rava says. According to Rava, what David HaMelech was referring to was Batsheva. And what he says is like this. Ru'uya, says the truth is Ru'uya haisa Batsheva bes Eliam leDavid Misheshis Mebereshis. The truth is Batsheva was meant to be David HaMelech's wife. This woman who it seems to be was taken in all the wrong ways was actually meant to be David HaMelech's wife. Ella, he was meant to be his wife. Ella Shaba'a Allah b'macho. But nevertheless, it came about through pain. In other words, he was, even though that Batsheva really was meant to be David Melech's wife, but he didn't let the process happen naturally. It almost implies like the story, the way it was meant, Batsheva was meant to be his wife. And if you look in the notes over here in the article, actually says something very, very significant, which is that the Maharal says, the commentary of the Maharal says, he says, it must be that this wasn't a mistake in marriage. You know, you hear the term, people will get married, and then they say, oh, this was a mistake. This wasn't meant to be. There's marriages which are meant to be, and marriages which aren't meant to be. So you could look at the story of David and Batsheva and say, this clearly was not meant to be, because he came about through sin. It came about through a mistake. It came about through a test which David did not pass, right? By all accounts, whether we call David that he sinned or he didn't sin, he didn't pass the test. So it would seem to be that this was not a marriage that was meant to be. He says, no, it was meant to be. It just was meant to be in a different way. And the Maharal says that it must be that Batsheva was meant to be David HaMelech's wife. How? How do we know that? Because who was the son of Batsheva? Shlomo, King Solomon. So to say that this was all a mistake, how could it be a mistake? Shlomo Melech, which is the destiny, the descendant of the successor of David HaMelech, and the grandfather of Mashiach. So clearly it was meant to be. Anyways, therefore, he says all this leads to the fact that Batsheva was meant to be his wife. And maybe, the Gemara doesn't say this clearly, maybe the fact is Uriah was going to die in that war. Maybe Uriah was destined to die in that war. This is my own point. He was at war. He did die. Maybe that was what was destined to happen. And then after that would happen, David, some sort of high-end shadchan, some high-end matchmaker would say, by the way, King, I've got a match for you. I know you already have 17 wives, but here it's number 18. It'll be great. And yes.
Isn't that kind of like a concept that applies in other categories as well, like with money? If someone can be destined to make $2 million, but they could steal it or they could earn it. Like,
correct.
Basically.
Yes. In fact, it's very closely related to the verse in this parasha. I'm going to get to it in a second. I want to focus on this because it's actually very fascinating. Just the Gemara continues along these lines. Tana Devei Rabbi Shmuel, and the yeshiva of Rabbi Shmuel, they taught the same exact idea, which is he should have, it's true that Batsheva was meant to be David HaMelech's wife. Ella rather she'achla paga. Paga means he ate the fruit while it was too ripe. No, let it hang on the tree a little longer. The apple, whatever fruit it is, wait for it to ripen. Let the avocado soften. Whatever word you want, whatever example you want to give. It was meant to be for David HaMelech, but he rushed that, and maybe even there was a certain divine inclination. In other words, we believe we have a very interesting, to focus on this for a little bit. We have a tradition that when a man and woman are drawn to one another. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's an appropriate relationship, but often it says it's because their souls are drawn to each other. You know, there's a certain soul that the neshama, when we say, oh, I fell in love with someone, or we were immediately attracted to each other. So we could look at it as something very external. Oh, we were attracted because externally, I like the way she looked, she liked me, we enjoy hanging out with each other. But according to Kabbalah, often, what could very well be, is that when a man and a woman are attracted to one another, it's because their souls, their neshamas, sense that there's a certain compatibility here. And that explains that sometimes attraction doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that this person who I dated or I went out with didn't click. I mean, this person, it clicked. Can I explain why? Does it really make? No, it doesn't really make sense to me. It just clicked. So again, Kabbalistically, it could mean, and I'm saying it could mean because I don't want to mislead give the notion that every attraction is meant to be, is a attraction of souls, which should be. But it could very well be that when the shamas are drawn to one, that when people are attracted to each other, it's because the souls sense a certain compatibility. And so therefore, you can now understand, looking at this story, when David was so attracted to Batsheva, let's think about this for a moment. Without getting into details. David HaMelech was a king. He had wives. You can imagine that David HaMelech saw many beautiful women, and he had wives before this. Sure, they were beautiful women. So it's probably more than just a physical attraction. He probably sensed that there was some sort of spiritual link. And he was right. And that's where this Gemara's explanation comes in. That the truth is Batsheva was his bashert. It was his bashert, but he didn't do it properly. He didn't wait for the right time to come. And it would have happened properly instead he waited. What's interesting is, some of you may remember that we learned the Gemara, I don't know how long ago, a few months ago, about the person who was saved from sin by his tzitzis. Anybody remembers that story?
Absolutely.
Oh, it's a great story. Where a person, he said, there was this world famous prostitute, and he spent a whole lot of money to go travel to her, and he was about to sin with her. The Gemara gives a very descriptive situation of how she was preparing herself for him and vice versa. And suddenly, at the last minute, he says he felt his tzitzis actually hit him in his face, and he was reminded, and he said, "That's it. I'm not continuing with this sin. Or I'm not continuing with this behavior." She was shocked, and she couldn't believe it. She said, "Do you see anything wrong with me?" He said, "No, you're as perfect as can be, but I have witnesses on me. My witnesses are my tzitzis." That's the Gemara, the story of the Gemara there, which we studied over here. What's the end of that story? The end of that story, if you recall, is that she asks, "Well, who's your Rosh Yeshiva? Where do you learn?" And he tells her. Then she goes to the Rosh Yeshiva and she says, "I'd like to convert. I've been so inspired by this student of yours that I'd like to convert." And she converts, and then this teacher says, "By the way, I have an idea for someone for you to marry." And who's that? That very student. And says the Gemara, the conclusion of the Gemara is that the same bed that she had initially prepared for sin was prepared now to heter in permissibility and with the mitzvah. So you see over there this same concept. And that is that, again, that woman was bashert for him. It was meant to be. In that situation, unlike David HaMelech, in that situation, he actually waited and he was able to wait and he was able to hold himself back. And his intended woman, it happened eventually beheaded. So you see an interesting parallel between that story and this story here with David HaMelech. The reason now, Ellie, you brought the idea that sometimes a person is meant to get something and he could either get it in deceit through sin or through permissibility. What's interesting is, don't want to go off too much, but the Torah portion this week includes a verse. And the verse states, it's somewhat, it's not this exact idea, but a very similar idea. The Torah states you should build a fence around your roof. And why? You build a new house, you should build a fence around your roof, which literally means the fallen one will fall from your roof. It doesn't say the person will fall from your roof. It's the fallen one will fall from your roof. What does that mean? Why the fallen one will fall from your roof? The idea is that this person is destined to fall. This person, if they, God forbid, fall from your roof, they were meant to fall. But nevertheless, they could fall from your roof, or if you protect your roof, their fall could happen elsewhere. So it's the same idea, that it's similar in the sense that which is meant to happen will happen. The only question is am I going to be a part of that in a negative way or not? So it's over here, what was meant to happen, happened. Batsheva was meant to be David HaMelech's wife. She was meant to conceive and give birth to Shlomo HaMelech. But it was a question of how it's going to happen. So this is a truism in many areas of Judaism, that what's meant to happen happens. Now my choice is how it's going to happen. Am I going to make it happen by way of sin or by way of mitzvah, or am I, so that's a very important part of Jewish faith and how we see reality and how we see the operation of God's world.
Rashi say that Migalgalim Zakai
Zuchuta is Zakai, right.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's first point from Rava on this Gemara. Now let's move on to another, continuing in the process of David HaMelech's response to his mistake. So says Rava continues. What does it mean? Darash Rava says, what is the meaning of the pasuk? And now we're going to go back to Tehillim. Another verse in Tehillim which now becomes clear and understood with this story. And that is, it's Tehillim chapter 35, verse number 15. And the pasuk says, Ubetzali samchu v'ne'esafu ne'esu alai mechin v'lo yadati karu v'lo dami. 38:15, which in English means, when I limped, they rejoiced and gathered. The lame gathered against me, but I gave it no thought. They tore at me and would not be silenced. Pretty harsh, but what does he mean? And David HaMelech experienced many challenges in life, many enemies, but what each one he described differently. Here he's talking about enemies who I limped, they rejoiced and gathered. Now we can understand that any great leader and any mighty warrior, people rejoice when they falter. But who exactly is he referring to? That they limped, and when I limped, they rejoiced, they gathered against me, and I gave it no thought. They tore at me and would not be silenced. Now, clearly it's not an enemy that David HaMelech battled against. This is clearly a different type of enemy. Because if this is one of those enemies that he waged war against, it doesn't fit with the words. The words are, they gathered against me and I gave it no thought, implying there are people who fought me and I ignored them, or they bother me and I ignored them. That's none of the most of the enemies that David HaMelech dealt with. You have to face and you have to defeat. So who could be this enemy that David HaMelech is talking about, who gathered against me and I ignored them? So here we're talking about a different enemy. Not talking about the armies that David HaMelech had to wage war against, but rather we're talking about among the Jewish people who were. Now in hindsight, we think David HaMelech, David HaMelech Yisrael Chai V'Kayam, the great David HaMelech, who could ever speak negatively against him? But in his lifetime, he had people who were speaking against him. That's the part of the business of being a leader, is that people are going to try to find problems with you. And just like Moshe Rabbeinu, right? Who's greater than Moshe? And yet in his time, he had many people challenging him, or not challenging him, speaking maliciously about it. What is the story? Let's spell out what he's talking about. He says, Amar David Lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, David HaMelech said to God, Ribono Shel Olam, God in heaven, Galu v'yadua lefanecha, it is known and revealed to you, She'im hayu koirin b'sari, that if they would tear my flesh, lo hayadami shoses, my blood would not flow. Why not? Why would my blood not flow if my flesh was torn? What he means, Rashi explains, Lo hayadami shoses means that we have this concept that when you shame someone publicly, it says they turn white. In other words, their blood drains from their face. And what he meant to say is that because I've been publicly humiliated, it's as if they've already drained my blood. This is why we have a very powerful statement among the sages, which we're going to get to in a moment, that when someone, and you have to be something we should be so careful of, that when you shame someone publicly, there's a certain equivalence of that to killing someone.
Hold on. That's a sin.
It's more than just a sin. It's certainly a sin.
Hold on. I work for a Muslim company. It's a family business.
All right.
And I love to public shame people who don't do anything. And we all do it because that's usually the only way they get them to do any work public shame. So am I committing a sin then?
You should not be publicly shaming people.
But then what? Then we start working. So I get
And they don't tell themselves, right? Therefore, is that
what?
Well, let's see. Let's finish this Talmud and then we'll get back to this. Let's see. I think what is.
It works great. I don't see a problem with that. It's not working, so it's fine.
So it's interesting. This came up recently. Not recently. Again, one of our classes, probably close to, 7-8 months ago, we spoke about the top. I think it was at a class. Someone brought up the question about roasting. Roasting, there's a whole thing today. You roast someone. There's an event and someone, and you have someone, I don't know if they're on stage or sitting up in front of everybody. And the question is, can you roast a person? Or can you go to an event in which there's roasting going on? What's the answer?
This is how Trump became a president.
So the question is, can you do it or not? Now, the argument for it is saying, well, this person agreed to this arrangement. But I would say one should avoid that behavior and avoid such gatherings. because even if technically they agreed, it's not so clear that they really agreed. It's not so clear that someone is really comfortable with being humiliated publicly, even if it's for the sake of good humor. And as you'll see, let's read this Gemara. Maybe after this Gemara, we'll go back to that question. What is this? So he says, continuing what David says, if they would tear my flesh, there wouldn't be any blood. What he means, not literally. He's saying they drain my blood by their acts of shaming me. Below, he says, furthermore, not only in circumstances, in their free time, would they shame me? And he's referring to the sin of Batsheva. That's what he's talking about. He's saying because of my mistake with Batsheva, and it was known, and it didn't look good, and so therefore people were talking about it. But not only were they talking about it, they actually used Torah, their Torah study, they used it to shame me. How so? Ella, when they are studying Arba Mises based, when they're studying in the topic, in the Torah topic of the 4 forms of capital punishment. Torah, we have examples of, there's different sins, and there's capital punishment in certain sins. And there's there's 4 different capital forms of capital punishment. And when in the yeshiva halls, they're studying the 4 different, there's skilos, reifa, kind of like 4 different types. They pause their Torah study, and they turn to me, and in a cynical way, and they say, David, I'm not sure if it's intentional. They don't say Melata, they say David. Habal Eishes Ish Misaso Bema. Somebody who commits adultery, what is the form of capital punishment for that person? Wait, so they say, but the point is, why are they turning to me and asking that? They know the answer to it. Because they are trying to remind me and humiliate me publicly for my sin. What's my response? And this is a good Gemara to remember. This is a good Gemara to remember because in situations where you perhaps come across someone who is humiliating someone publicly, and maybe they're humiliating them for a mistake they really made, and you're going to go over to that person and you're going to say, you shouldn't do this. You shouldn't.
There's a big difference.
You shouldn't humiliate this person publicly. They're going to say, what do you mean? Look what they did wrong. Remember this Gemara, because you'll be able to respond with this Gemara. So what does David HaMelech say when they tell him, what does it mean? What is it? He's being put on the spot. You can imagine, everyone's quiet. What's David going to respond? What is the punishment for someone who commits adultery? But, so he says, just a second, so what is his answer? Amarti lahem, I said to them, what's my response to them? That someone who commits acts of adultery, then the punishment, the capital punishment for them would be chenek, which is joking. Which, by the way, again, without getting into this, practically speaking, capital punishment was very rarely carried out. In fact, according to some opinions, it happened once every 70 years. But nevertheless, according to Torah, that would be the punishment if all the conditions were met. That would be his punishment. It would be with a form of choking. So he says that is the punishment for that sin is chenek, is this form of death. However, however, such a person has a portion in the world to come. Maybe they committed a sin which is so great that it deserves capital punishment, but nevertheless, they certainly are awarded a portion in the world to come. In fact, the punishment is their cleansing. But someone who humiliates their friend in public, and the word over here has Hamalbin. Hamalbin is connected to what word? Lavan, white, because you cause them to turn white. Hamalbin nechaber barabin. Then such a person such a person does not have a portion in the world to come. So this, he says, as great as the sin is, the punishment is their atonement. Someone who humiliates someone publicly, they're not blessed with a portion in the world to come. So this is the response. He says, people humiliated me, but he stood strong. So when you hear this, it gives us another reminder that as terrible as a sin may be, so much so that you think, well, I need to publicly shame this person because of what they've done. This Gemara is a reminder. Now, to understand this fully, there is a halacha about the obligation of rebuking someone. And this is where we have, it's a very nuanced thing. On the other hand, we have a Torah obligation to rebuke someone. You're not allowed to shame someone, but you are obligated to rebuke someone. And if you look in the Rambam, it talks about it. Sometimes if you feel the rebuke is going to help, it's possible you can even rebuke a person publicly. If you first rebuke them privately and they didn't listen, there is a circumstance in which you could rebuke someone publicly to get them to do tshuva. But there's a difference between rebuking someone and shaming someone. Sometimes it's not that easy to tell the difference. You have to be able to be honest with yourself. Certainly, this is a case of shame. Certainly, if it's in the aftermath of a mistake, not current, that's for sure shaming someone. Yes.
So what classifies as public? Is it 10 Jewish men? Is that public or 5?
I don't know. I don't know if in this situation it's about a specific number, because over here it's a logical issue. When you do this to a person, you're causing them that what we call the face whitening. You're causing them. I don't know if this follows the guidelines of it has to be 10 and it has to be a minion. I don't know if this. I think it just means public. In front of a group of people in such a way this person feels that terrible feeling of shame.
Because I remember like a few months ago, so it was like a few months ago, we learned in Gemara about like where they made them change their laces publicly.
Correct. That's different, because that has to do with sanctifying God's name publicly. Yes, there is the idea of sanctifying Kiddush Hashem, sanctifying God's name publicly. Over there, it says it's specifically a minyan. But in these situations, you go by the logic. The logic there is it's not about sanctification. It's not saying it's about the feeling the person has. And that feeling the person has, I don't think you can say it has to do with 9 people. You don't have the feeling. With 10 people, you do have it. It's the feeling, and especially since this is not there's no halacha connected to it. It's not like this is just saying this person loses a portion of what's to come. So I would say avoid this, even if it's in front of 2 or 3 people. But it's interesting, again, that the same Torah which says you're not allowed to shame someone requires us to rebuke someone. So sometimes Torah is not always, it's not so easy. You have to really, to do the right thing, sometimes it's not so simple. You have to be able to know that, you may say, because I want to avoid shaming this person because of what the Gemara says, how terrible it is, I'll avoid it and go to the other extreme and never point out their flaws. No, that's also a mistake. Because if you can help someone get better, and the only way to do so is to rebuke them, and you're obligated to rebuke.
Okay, so what if you have a sports event? 2 teams playing, 2 Jewish teams playing against the other, one Jewish team playing against basketball team playing against some other team, and you totally destroy them. Would that be creation? And you would say you be the
I'll have to check.
110.
I'll have to check the rabbinic sources and get back to you.
I'm just curious.
Right.
That's up and every.
No, I mean, look, what you're asking is actually a good question. We all know what good sportsmanship means and what good sportsmanship isn't. And there's this idea that at some point, in a good sport is someone who does not look to just, what do they call, pile it on or whatever. And these stories, especially with children when they're playing sports. Yes. One second. Go ahead. Yeah.
All right, 2 things. 1, in a sporting event, if a coach goes off on a player or the team, is that considered public humiliation? And 2, what if you are in your privacy, your own home, you have a few other guests there, and then you go off on someone in there? Is that considered?
Wait, in your own home?
Yeah, or someone else's home. Or
It doesn't matter. So the second example, I'll say it doesn't matter. Whether it's your home, someone else's home, anytime it's public, you're not allowed to you're not allowed to publicly humiliate someone. When it comes to sports, it's another area where, like the example you gave, it's an excellent example. And that's where, as a coach, you hope you want the coach to keep people in line, and you want the coach. I mean, there's other examples. There's a teacher, a counselor. I mean, there's so many circumstances in which a person who is in a position of authority, who is supposed to motivate and perhaps, but there's a difference between, you have to know where that line is crossed, where the line is drawn, and where the line is crossed. And again, Judaism demands us to be very intelligent about this, because again, the line between rebuke and shame could sometimes be very narrow. But you have to know, you have to be very careful and make sure what is the intent of my heart. Is the intent of my heart right now to rebuke and to really return this person to better? Then maybe it's okay. but even then, it says you can only rebuke someone publicly. If you try to do it privately and it didn't work, then, and you think that the public rebuke will help, there may be a place for it. But in many situations, it's clearly not rebuke. Again, especially in the circumstance where the person made the mistake a while ago, when you're simply bringing up a previous mistake, that's certainly not rebuke, that's only shame. And you see how severe it is. And what David saying is, your embarrassing me publicly is worse than the sin of adultery, which I did. That's how serious. And again, so bring us back to our question we said earlier about a roasting and this. It's just best to avoid it because you're playing with fire. You're playing with fire when you have an event which centers around embarrassing someone, even if supposedly it's all in good jest and supposedly the person agreed to it. It's something which is very dangerous. And generally speaking, the idea is just to avoid it. Okay, let's get back to this. There's more. Yes. I want to get to a little bit more of the Gemara, so we'll take one more.
It seems like a lot of these scenarios, if not all of them, really boil down to the spirit of Lashon Hara. Really, what you're doing is that you're false elevating yourself by public embarrassment or confrontation, even rebuke. Because almost always when that's done, that's really to elevate.
Right, lift myself up at the expense of someone else. Yes, but on a technical level, Lashon Hara actually is not in that person's presence. So when we say Lashon Hara, we're referring to gossip, which is behind the person's back. Here it's in front of them, and therefore. Okay, let's move on because we have more to the story. So David HaMelech says that was his response to them. Okay, I want to skip a little bit now, if you are following the Gemara, because it goes into different stories about David HaMelech, which are interesting, and if you on your own, I encourage you to read it. So I'm going to skip a little bit further down in the page, and that is, if you're following the ArtScroll, we go to 107A4. So the words Darash Rabbi Dostoi of the Diminbiri. Rabbi Dostoi Diminbiri, if you're following the Hebrew text, it's the last three lines of the last three words of the line, about 12 lines up on the bottom of the page. Darash Rabbi Dostoi Diminbiri. So now again, we see David HaMelech suffers from his mistake. He suffers shame, and now we find him pleading with God to forgive him. Darash Rabbi Dostoi Diminbiri. Lema David Doimba, what is David HaMelech similar to? L'soicher kuti, to a kuti business person, to a kuti merchant. What does that mean? Kuti merchant. Let's look at Rashi. What was the nature of the kuti merchant? Darko says Rashi, Lefanos es choroso ma'at ma'at laha'amida al damim mu'at. He says the kuti merchant, if someone has, if you want to make money, suppose you have you have a lot of a certain item, and you want to make money. You have 100 soap bars. So how are you going to make money? Not by selling it in bulk, but by selling it one bar at a time. If you can get a purchaser for every bar, you're going to make a lot more money than if you sell 100 or even 10 at a time. So that was the kuti. They were skilled in that regard to take an item and kind of break it down to as many little pieces as they can and sell it like that. So here it says David HaMelech had that talent in his negotiation with God. This is the kuti would say, here, let me sell you a little bit. And then you come back the next day, I ran out of toothpaste. I have another bottle for you. Here you go, I'll sell it again. And so therefore, David HaMelech had this approach with God. How so? David HaMelech said to God, Rebbeinu Shalom, and here again, we're going to a verse in Tehillim. And this verse is Tehillim chapter 19, verse number 13 and 14. So here's what he said. Now, he's going to break up the verse into different statements. The first here, Rabbi Shneur, he says, Shkios miyavin. Shkios miyavin means who can understand mistakes. So what he means to say is, can I really be held accountable for my mistakes? A shkia is a mistake. What does it mean, a mistake? The word mistake is broad. Shkia means what's the right word for shkia is error. Yeah, but it is a negligence, an act of negligence. In other words, I didn't intend to do it, but the word mistake sometimes could be like, I couldn't do it. There's different, in Judaism, we have onus and shkia. Onus means something which there's nothing I could have done about it. It's a mistake, And then there's a shkia. Shkia means it was negligent. So I'm somewhat responsible for it. I don't have to do tshuva for something I'm totally not responsible for. But I am somewhat responsible for it. He says, but can we really be held accountable for all of our shkios? That was his first. Shkios miyavin. So God says, Amarle, you know what? Shviki lach. I will forgive you for all of your acts of negligence. Okay, the next words in the pasuk, David HaMelech says, "Umi nistaros nakeni." Nistaros means from unknown sins, clean me. What does that mean? Sins which were not negligent. In other words, I knew what I was doing, but it's something that others didn't know about, unknown to others. So again, like the kuti business person who says, "Let me sell you a little bit." You agree? Oh, okay, I'll buy one. Tomorrow you'll come back, you'll buy another one. So he says, Ronald says, first forgive me for the acts of negligence. That's just fine. Now he says, okay, now please can you forgive me for the sins that I did, which people aren't aware of. Now, why is that significant, whether people are aware of it or not? It is. Because when we sin and it's public knowledge, then in addition to the sin, there's also the chilul Hashem. There's also desecration of God's name, especially when it's a king, when someone holy. When someone holy or righteous commits a sin, so if it's unknown to the public, so it's just a sin between them and God. So it's a sin, but just between them and God. But if it's known, that becomes an added component, which is the desecration of God's name. So he says, forgive me for the sins that people don't know about. So what does God say? Shviki lach, fine. I am, you're forgiven. Okay, so David HaMelech says, okay, now that worked, he says, Gam mizeidim chasol chadecha. These are all the words in the same verse, chapter 19 of Psalm. He says, Gam mizeidim chasol chadecha. Also from intentional sins, forgive me. Not just the sins which are negligent. Not just the sins, not that you forgive me for the sins which nobody knows about, even the sins which people know about, which means that as the added element that it causes a chilul Hashem, nevertheless, forgive me for those two. And what does God say? Shviki lach, you're forgiven for those two. Then he goes on to say, Al yim shalubi, the next words of the verse. Don't let them rule over me. In other words, the lo lishto rabbanan. Please give me the following gift. You've forgiven me now for all my sins. My next request is that I don't want the sages talking about me in a negative way. The fact that you've forgiven me, that's great. God forgives me. Can you cause that the sages don't look at me negatively for my mistake? And God says, God agrees to that too. Shviki lach. God agrees to that too. So far, David is success. 4 for 4. Acts of negligence, sins in private, even sins in public, and that they shouldn't speak negatively about me. And this is where he runs into the first obstacle. The first 4, no problem. The 5th request, he says, V'nikesi ni peshara, which this is the last verse of that verse. I shall be perfect, I shall be cleansed. The Nikesi means cleansed. What was he mean? He was already forgiven. What does it mean to be cleansed? I already was forgiven. His request over here, Shalo yikase sarchuni. He asks of God, let the story of my mistake not be written. It's in the Torah, in the Tanakh, the story of Batsheva is written. He says, can you remove that from the Tanakh? Let it be, what's the word, expunged? From the record. Can I have the story expunged from the record so nobody will ever, because I did tshuva, I did repent, and you've forgiven me. So can we remove it from the record? That God says, no, that I can't do for you, sorry. Why not? And by the way, if you think about it, David HaMelech says, why does he want it removed from the record? After all, we know the story, and the Talmud tells us that he did tshuva, he did repent, but in the world, how do they see the story of David and Batsheva? And how does that reflect negative? How does that reflect to people who don't know the Talmud? Most people who know the story of David and Batsheva, oh, okay, David was a mighty king, and he also committed adultery. That's the way people who are familiar with. I mean, many people today have no idea of these stories, but those that are familiar with the stories of the Bible will say that this was his mistake. So you see why David HaMelech wanted it erased. He says, why do I need yes, I did tshuva, and yes, those who study will know I did tshuva, but there's so many people are just going to hear this story and they'll come to their own conclusions. But nevertheless, God says, let me just finish this line, we'll get to it. God says, no, I can't do that. He says, why can't I do that? An interesting reason. God says, God says, that I can't do. He says, Uma Yud. If the letter Yud, this is one letter, Shanatalti Nisarai, when I change in the Torah, when God changes, initially, Abraham and Sarah were not Abraham and Sarah. They were Abram and Sarai, right? That was her name. And then God says, Sarai is no longer Sarai, but she'll be Sarah. Now, God changed to Abram too. He said, your name is no longer Abram, but it'll be Abraham. So he just added a letter, didn't remove any letters from Abram's name. But with Sarai, he changed the name from Sarai to Sarah, which means he replaced the Yud with the Hey. Says the Medrash, the Yud was very upset. Here I am, I'm part of the Torah, I'm part of and now you left me. And so to say, obviously this is all metaphoric. It says the letter Yud was screaming at me, God says, for many years. Until Joshua came, and I gave Joshua that Yud. The Yud that I removed from Sarai, I gave to Yeshua. How so? Because again, what do we have in the Torah? His name was initially Hoshea. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, no longer is your name Hoshea, it will be Yehoshua. So God says, even when I removed the Yud, I had headaches, so to say, for years until I found a way to put the Yud back into Torah. I gave it back to Yehoshua. Says, how much more so? Here you have a portion of Torah which is written, spelled out. How could I remove a whole chapter of Torah? How could I remove a whole chapter of Torah? Yes, for your sake, but something which is part of Torah, I cannot remove. Therefore, he says, this part of Torah will always be there. Yes.
Okay, so I have two questions. So one of them is, how come David didn't just ask Hashem that, like, there be added clarity, people's understanding of the full story? Since you could ask that the sage's mind would be changed about, like, their deal with him. And then my other question is, was it really like a Hil Hashem if it wasn't like committed in public and it wasn't really a sin, like we said?
Well, okay, so the first question is a great question. That was why can't it be written in such a way where his tshuva is clearly accepted? I believe it is. In other words, if you look at the story, he turns to Nasan and he says, I've done tshuva, chatasi, and his tshuva is accepted. So much so, and therefore all the psukim in Tehillim are there to prove that. And you see, almost like by the fact that this marriage led to the birth of King Solomon. So really, if a person does take the time to read the story, you can see that clearly he does the tshuva, and he says so clearly, the Torah does describe his tshuva. Then he remained married to her. So in that sense, maybe it's a good question. But I think that, but nevertheless, someone else says, I don't want the mistake mentioned. I don't want the tshuva mentioned. I just remove it from the record altogether. God says you can't do that. As to your second question, apparently it was known. It wasn't like done in absolute secrecy. He sent people to go get Batsheva. So, and then he married her. So it wasn't in absolute secrecy. Apparently it became known.
It wasn't a sin. So it felt like a Hil Hashem.
It was, but it certainly looked like a sin. Because as you said, by all measures, he was with the woman while her husband was at work. Again, it's a halachic loophole which shows us that it wasn't the sin of Eshes Ish, wasn't a sin of adultery.
But also,
I think we'll stop here, by the way. We'll take some more questions, but I think we'll conclude that.
also the husband Uriah was Mored B'Malchut. He was against the kingdom, yes, David HaMelech, right? So
Right.
He could kill him. So
Right.
everyone
But
knows
all this was unknown at the time. That wasn't public knowledge. What was publicly seen was David HaMelech, taking Batsheva as her husband was off in war. So yes, now we know that it wasn't Eshes Ish. What's interesting is that even in the Gemara, when they turned to him and said, somebody who commits an act of adultery, what is his tshuva? He doesn't respond defending himself. He doesn't even get into it. You'd say, well, he had 3 different answers. He could have said he gave her a get for this. He understood that wasn't the place. They weren't really looking for an explanation.
Right.
They needed to be reviewed, and therefore what they needed to be told was, all right, that will wrap it up. We did not finish this Gemara. If you want on your own, you certainly can. There's more to it, but I think. What's that? Yeah, we'll have to get back to you about that.
And also, the people you gave, I don't know, if that makes it okay.